Miss Marple and the Dead Man's Nightcap. Chapter 1. It was the sort of evening that made one feel grateful for small things. Honeysuckle drifting on the breeze, the chime of distant church bells, and the tinkle of teacups on fine bone china. Ishin, the garden of the Fitzwilliam cottage, the annual Whitsun Garden supper, was in full swing. All gingham tablecloths, fruit tarts, and polite laughter. Miss Marple sat at the edge of the gathering beneath a lilac tree, her knitting resting in her lap, untouched. She wore a pale blue shawl and a thoughtful expression, her eyes observing rather than participating. Though she offered polite smiles, her gaze roamed with quiet purpose. Across the lawn, Colonel Lucius Erskine raised a cut-glass tumbler in a mock toast. "To village tradition," he bellowed, the faintest slur riding on the end of his words. The assembled neighbours chuckled with habitual politeness, though a few glanced at each other. "Always the showman," whispered Mrs. Wilton, a plump widow with a fondness for gossip and currant scones. Colonel Erskine stood out, not just for his brashness, but for the sharp cut of his tweeds and his unapologetic disdain for what he called provincial nonsense. Since his return to Chippingdean 5 months prior, after nearly 20 years abroad, he'd inserted himself squarely into village life, uninvited yet impossible to ignore. As the Colonel pontificated about the virtues of brandy over wine, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. He was on his 3rd drink and growing looser by the syllable. But it wasn't his voice that caught her attention. It was the way Mrs. Cecily Blackthorne's expression tightened as he laughed. A subtle thing. Her teacup stilled mid-air, her lips drawn ever so slightly. "Odd," Miss Marple murmured. "Did you say something, Jane?" asked Reverend Mallow, settling beside her with the tired relief of a man escaping church committee chatter. "Only that it's odd for people to wear masks in a place so small, don't you think?" He smiled, confused, and said nothing more. From the terrace steps came the sound of glass breaking. All turned to see Colonel Erskine clutching his wrist, having dropped his nightcap, a distinctive tumbler etched with the Erskine crest. His face reddened as he barked, "Blast it! Slippery fingers!" "I'll fetch another," said young Ned Blackthorne, already moving. Cecily, his aunt, did not look up. The sun dipped behind the hedge line. The garden turned gold, then blue. Somewhere in the shrubbery, a nightingale began its serenade. By 9 o'clock, the guests began to drift away, waving goodbyes and collecting half-empty serving trays. Miss Marple stayed behind to help Mrs. Fitzwilliam tidy. As she gathered napkins from the lawn, she heard the unmistakable sound of raised voices from within the house. One was Colonel Erskine, the other Cecily Blackthorne. "Said you'd never speak of it," Cecily hissed. "I've kept your secret long enough. You forget, my dear, who paid your husband's debts in Calcutta." Silence. Then the unmistakable clink of glass. Miss Marple paused mid-step, head slightly inclined toward the window. Another voice joined, Mrs. Fitzwilliam, flustered. Now, let's not let a little disagreement spoil the evening." By the time the guests had gone and the plates were stacked, Colonel Erskine had vanished without fanfare, muttering about walking home. No one seemed surprised, least of all Cecily, who merely said she had a headache and asked her nephew to escort her home. Morning brought fog and gossip. By 8:30, news spread through the lanes. Colonel Erskine had been found slumped in the rose arbour behind his cottage, a half-empty glass by his side, and no signs of foul play. His housekeeper, Mrs. Dearling, tearfully reported he'd failed to come in the night before. She found him stiff and silent, with a bitter smell in the air. The doctor, summoned at once, muttered something about a weak heart and overindulgence. The local constable, Sergeant Pike, chalked it up to drink and old age. But Miss Marple, upon hearing the details over her breakfast porridge, simply dabbed her lips and said, "People rarely leave their front doors locked and the back gate open if they expect to fall asleep in the garden." She stood, adjusted her hat, and reached for her gloves. "I believe I shall go out for a little walk." Outside the Colonel's ivy-draped cottage, villagers milled quietly, their voices low, their expressions tight with interest. Miss Marple passed them with a nod, lifting the latch on the back gate as though she'd done it every day of her life. The rose arbour was lovely in morning light, bees bumbling lazily among the petals, dew still clinging to the grass, and there, exactly as described, was the chair. The empty tumbler beside it was smudged with fingerprints. The remnants of a cigar stub lay beside the armrest. Miss Marple crouched slightly. "Not quite the sort of man to leave a cigar half-smoked," she murmured. Then her eyes settled on the soil beneath the chair, lightly scuffed, as if someone had moved the chair, or the man in it. She stood slowly, smoothing her skirt. At the edge of the garden, Sergeant Pike appeared, tipping his helmet. "Ah, Miss Marple, come to see the scene, have you?" "Only to pay respects," she replied gently, "though I couldn't help but notice." She gestured to a faint set of impressions, high-heeled, pointed toes, leading from the arbour to the side path. "Someone left in rather a hurry, wouldn't you say?" Pike blinked. "Didn't notice that." "No," she said, folding her hands. "Curious. I do hope, for Cecily Blackthorn's sake, that you haven't overlooked too much." Pike turned sharply. "Why would you mention her?" "Oh, no reason at all," Miss Marple said lightly, her eyes drifting toward the horizon, "except that she doesn't drink. And yet I distinctly saw her retrieve the Colonel's nightcap last evening. Odd, don't you think?" And without another word, she turned and walked toward the lane, leaving the first chill of suspicion curling through, the air like early mist. Chapter 2. By midday, Chipping Dean was a village bustling with sorrow and speculation in equal measure. The postmistress, the greengrocer, and the vicar's wife had each taken it upon themselves to deliver condolences to Colonel Erskine's housekeeper, and to gather what details they could, as was customary in matters of sudden death. Inside the parlour of her rose-draped cottage, Miss Marple sat with a fresh cup of tea, the newspaper unopened on her lap. She hadn't yet read the official report. She already knew what it would say. Heart failure, or perhaps natural causes. But Miss Marple had spent her life watching people lie with a straight face and a trembling hand, and she knew something else lingered behind the Colonel's sudden demise. It wasn't that he had enemies, though he had a few. It was the particular shape of silence at the garden party, the kind that follows something said a little too loudly, or not said at all. The inquest had not yet been scheduled, but preparations for a memorial service were already underway. It would be held at St. Mary Mead on Friday, and it seemed every household had a part to play. Organising flowers, reading hymns, baking fruit loaves. Grief, as always, came with chores. Miss Marple found herself near the churchyard that afternoon, her walk timed suspiciously well with the passing of Mrs. Cecily Blackthorne. The woman walked alone, carrying a book of sheet music under one arm. She paused when she saw Miss Marple, offering a smile too precise to be natural. "Miss Marple," Cecily said, nodding, "out enjoying the air." "It clears the head," Miss Marple replied with a pleasant tone, "though I find the fog hasn't quite lifted. Not here." She glanced toward the bell tower. "Are you singing at the service?" "I am. Abide with me, I believe." The Colonel enjoyed a good hymn. There was a pause, the kind that grew awkward when no one filled it. "You knew him well, I gather," Miss Marple said gently. Cecily's fingers twitched slightly on the music book. "We grew up together. Our families were quite close once." Her voice held a brittleness that hadn't been there the night before. "He could be difficult, but he had presence." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Presence is often confused for virtue, I find." Cecily's expression shifted. "Do you think he suffered?" "A curious question," Miss Marple replied, eyes steady. "Why do you ask?" There was no answer, just a flutter of pages as Cecily adjusted the book in her arms. She excused herself moments later, murmuring something about choir practice. Miss Marple watched her go. The woman's pace was too swift for someone with nothing to hide. Back in the main square, the conversation was turning briskly practical. At the grocer's, a trio of women debated whether the Colonel would be buried with military honours. He was abroad for decades, did nothing for the village. But he was a colonel. "And what of the rumour?" whispered Mrs. Dillingham, leaning across the bin of apples. "That he'd written a new will, cut out the cousin in Dorset, gave it all to that Blackthorne boy." The grocer snorted. "Wouldn't be the first fool to let flattery undo sense." "Then, where's the will, eh?" said another. "Sergeant Pike said nothing's been found." That detail stuck with Miss Marple. She filed it away. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple called upon the vicarage under the pretence of returning a borrowed hymnal. The Reverend Mallow welcomed her with his usual warmth, ushering her into the drawing-room where the fire crackled despite the warm air. "I must say, Jane," he said, pouring her tea, "this business with the Colonel has rather unsettled everyone, though I expect the doctor was right. The man drank like a soldier." Miss Marple sipped politely. "Did he attend service much?" "Only once or twice since he returned. Always made some joke about fire and brimstone." He hesitated, eyes flicking toward the window. "Still, there's something rather unpleasant about dying that way. Alone in a chair, glass in hand." "Quite." A pause followed. The fire popped once, as if confirming something unspoken. "I understand Cecily Blackthorne had words with him that evening," Miss Marple said delicately. The vicar looked surprised. "Did she? I hadn't heard." "No, you wouldn't have," Miss Marple replied. "But one hears things, especially in small villages. She seemed strained this morning." The Reverend nodded slowly. "She and the Colonel were once close. I believe there was talk of a romance long ago, but it never came to anything. Family politics, I imagine." "Or secrets," Miss Marple said softly. "Old ones, the kind that sour over time." The vicar didn't respond. He didn't need to. That evening, as dusk folded itself over Chipping Dean once more, Ned Blackthorne lingered outside the village hall after choir rehearsal. He was a tall, ruddy-cheeked boy of 23, loyal to a fault and utterly unused to suspicion. And yet suspicion had found him. "You were the last to see the Colonel alive, weren't you?" asked Mary Cleves, a seamstress's daughter, with a knowing tone. "After Aunt Cecily went inside. I suppose I was," Ned said carefully. "He said he wanted to be alone. I gave him his drink and left." She eyed him. "And you didn't notice anything odd?" He hesitated. "He asked if I'd ever tried Indian brandy. Said he'd brought a case back from Bombay." Mary raised an eyebrow. "Did he offer you some?" "No. Said it was a nightcap for the old and the damned," Ned replied, voice lowering. "Sounded like a joke, but I don't know. He looked tired, like something was eating at him." She reached for his hand then, gently. "You don't think?" "I don't know what to think," Ned said. "But he was dead the next morning, and my aunt's been odd, distant." From the shadows near the garden gate, Miss Marple turned and walked away, silent as mist. Back at home, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and reviewed her notes, mental and otherwise. A tumbler, a missing will, a woman who didn't drink, bringing the Colonel his nightcap, a nephew who delivered the fatal glass, and someone who moved through the rose garden in heels that left just enough of a mark. She opened her drawer and took out a small envelope addressed to herself. Inside was a note, unsigned, clearly torn from the back of a ledger. He said, if I don't come forward, he will. That he knows what happened in Calcutta. That it's only a matter of time. There was no signature, no handwriting match, but Miss Marple had an idea forming. It wasn't finished, not yet, but it was forming. She placed the note back in the drawer, closed it with care, and reached for her lamp. Darkness settled outside her window, but in Miss Marple's mind the threads were beginning to tighten, and in the quiet corners of Chipping Dean, someone who thought they had killed without witnesses was starting to wonder if that nightcap had left more than a bitter aftertaste. Interrogation break. Your turn to answer, investigator. Where are you watching from? Drop your coordinates in the comments. Hit subscribe. The evidence we reveal next will change the game. Entirely. Chapter 3. By Thursday morning, a new tension curled through Chipping Dean like mist around hedgerows. Not grief, precisely. It was too brisk for that. But a sharper, more watchful sort of silence. It had settled over conversations, hovered between greetings, and followed Ned Blackthorne like a second shadow. At the village solicitor's office, behind polished brass lettering and drawn blinds, Mr. Cuthbert Lee flipped through a manila folder with increasing irritation. No will, he muttered for the third time, peering over his spectacles at Sergeant Pike. No official one, at any rate. Colonel Erskine made noise about rewriting it after his return, but nothing was deposited here, not even a draft. Pike frowned, notebook at the ready. And the previous one? Dated 1936. Leaves everything to his cousin Charles in Dorset. But that was before the business in India, before Cecily Blackthorne reappeared in his circle. The name hung in the room for a moment. Wouldn't be unusual for someone of the Colonel's type to keep things close, mind you, Lee added, I once had a client store his will inside a volume of Macbeth. Claimed it was dramatically appropriate. He gave a dry chuckle, but Pike didn't return it. Could someone have destroyed it? Lee tapped his desk. If so, they were very thorough. No ash, no fragments, no notes. And still, Miss Marple thought, people rarely go to such lengths to destroy something unless its contents were damning to someone close. At the market, conversation drifted in and out of casual tones, never far from the dead man's name. I heard he left it all to young Ned. Then why hasn't Ned said so? Because it's not true. It was Cecily he cared about. Old ties and all that. Then she must have it, tucked away where no one's looked. Such was the hum of things when Miss Marple entered the chemist's shop that same afternoon, ostensibly to refill a liniment. Mr. Burton, the bespectacled chemist, was dabbing at a spill with a cloth, his expression pinched. "Bit of a week, eh?" he said as she approached. "Indeed," she replied, "though I find these sorts of weeks always reveal more than they intend." He gave her a sidelong look, unsure whether it was a joke. "I imagine Colonel Erskine kept you busy," Miss Marple said lightly, folding her hands. "Now and then. Lumbago, mostly. And a tonic he insisted on that was nearly 80% proof." He chuckled. "I warned him." "Did he collect anything unusual the day before his death?" Burton frowned, then snapped his fingers. "Yes, a bottle of chlorodyne, pain relief. Said his nerves were acting up again. Odd thing was, he hadn't touched it in months." "Did anyone else ever collect his prescriptions?" "Oh, occasionally Mrs. Dearling or that young Blackthorn lad." "Why?" Miss Marple smiled. "No reason at all." But there was a reason, because chlorodyne, when mixed with strong drink, could do more than calm the nerves. That evening, Miss Marple visited the Fitzwilliam house under the pretense of discussing flower arrangements for the memorial. As they walked through the kitchen garden, the conversation turned, as it always did, to the Colonel. "I'll miss him," Mrs. Fitzwilliam said, plucking a dead head from a peony. "In his way, he brought life to the village. For better or worse. Did you know him well?" "Oh, not as well as Cecily. They were entangled, I believe, years ago, but she's never spoken of it." "I wonder," Miss Marple said gently, "if Cecily feared him." The older woman paused. "She feared something," she admitted. "I remember just last week seeing her cross the green when she spotted him outside the vicarage. She turned on her heel without a word. Miss Marple tucked that away. A change of direction said more than 1,000 words. "And Ned," she added, "how has he taken the news?" "He adored the Colonel, or thought he did. I believe the Dahajo old man frightened him too, though. Not in a brutal way, just the way thunder makes you flinch, even when you know it's far off." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already moving beyond the words, stitching together fragments, moments, pauses. Later, as twilight coloured the village in gold and mauve, Ned Blackthorne found himself walking the perimeter of the Colonel's now empty garden. The rose arbour stood still, the chair removed, the scent of pipe smoke lingering faintly despite the days. "He jumped when he saw her. Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. I often walk this way," she replied. "Gardens speak in silence, don't you think?" He gave a wan smile. "If they do, I suppose they'd say I'm a fool." "I don't think you are." He looked at her then, really looked. "Do you think someone killed him?" "I think people sometimes want things to go away. Sometimes people, sometimes paper." He stiffened. "And I think," she continued, "you've been carrying something heavy since that night." Ned's voice dropped. "He said he was going to change the will. Told me that evening. Said he'd sent the new one to his solicitor, but he had a copy locked in his desk just in case." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, and I never saw it. When I went to fetch a book for him later, I noticed the drawer was open, the desk was empty. She let the silence settle. "Do you think someone found it before he died?" he asked. "I think it's possible. But more curious is this. If he had indeed sent the will to the solicitor, and the solicitor never received it, then someone intercepted it. But who would—" Miss Marple's eyes held his. "Someone with access to the post, or to the house. Someone who knew what that paper meant, and who stood to lose the most if it saw light." Ned's face paled. "My aunt," Miss Marple said nothing. That night, as the village prepared for the memorial service, Miss Marple sat by her window, listening to the creak of branches and the tick of the old carriage clock. She thought of footsteps in the garden, of unopened drawers, of chlorodyne bottles and vanished documents. She thought of the note tucked in her drawer. "He said, if I don't come forward, he will—" There had been a time, years ago, when Cecily Blackthorne's name was spoken in scandal, though never proven, never public. A marriage cut short in India, debts, rumours of betrayal, and now a dead man with a sharp memory and a sharper tongue. "Beats." Marple lit a single candle and wrote 3 words in her notebook. "Cecily, chlorodyne, post." But something was still missing. She glanced at her shelf and then paused. A slender book sat there, borrowed and returned weeks ago. The Tempest. Inside, it was hollowed out and empty. Chapter 4. Friday morning brought a melancholy hush to Chipping Dean. The air was still, the church bells muffled, and black armbands appeared on coats and sleeves like silent declarations of civility. Yet beneath the surface of mourning, something sharper stirred, unease in the guise of tradition. St. Mary Mead Church filled slowly. Neighbours whispered in pews, adjusting hymn-sheets and stealing glances at the front row, where Cecily Blackthorne sat rigid, spine too straight, hands clasped, too tightly in her lap. Beside her, Ned looked pale but composed, his jaw clenched as though bracing for something more than a service. Miss Marple sat 3 rows back, quiet as ever, her eyes flicking from face to face with quiet precision. She wasn't looking for grief. She was watching for its absence. As the organ wheezed into Abide With Me, Cecily rose to lead the choir. Her voice, usually strong and practised, wavered on the first note. It faltered again midway, her hands shaking just enough for Missy Marple to notice, and more than that. Her eyes kept drifting to the front left of the altar, where the Colonel's photograph stood. It wasn't sadness that Cecily carried. It was weight, a particular kind of burden one does not share with others. After the service, Miss Marple found herself intercepted by Mrs. Dearling, the Colonel's housekeeper. She was a stout woman with watery eyes and a habit of speaking as though she might burst into tears at any moment. "Oh, Miss Marple," she began, clutching a black lace handkerchief. You've been such a comfort." Miss Marple offered a kind smile. "I merely listen, Mrs. Dearling." "And see things too, I dare say." She leaned closer. "I didn't say anything before, but I saw someone in the garden that night." Miss Marple's brows lifted. "I thought it was just my imagination, but now—" She glanced around. "It wasn't Ned, and it certainly wasn't the Colonel." "Who was it then?" "I don't know," she said, voice low. "But whoever it was wore something red. A scarf, I think. I saw it flash past the side window, and I remember thinking, who wears red in the dark?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Not someone trying to go unnoticed, certainly." Mrs. Dearling dabbed at her eyes. "It's been bothering me. I thought it didn't matter. But now I wonder—" "You were right to speak up," Miss Marple said gently. "Sometimes it's the flash of red that spoils the illusion." Later, that day, Sergeant Pike stood near the Colonel's study desk, frowning at a half-burnt piece of paper recovered from the hearth. The text was blurred, but a few lines remained. "To my godson, Edward Blackthorne, I bequeath—" The rest was blackened. "You were right," he told Miss Marple, who stood behind him with gloved hands folded. "Someone tried to burn a will." "Or tried to make us think it was the will," she said mildly. "The true version may still be missing, or hidden." Pike scratched his head. "That still doesn't tell us who slipped the chlorodyne into his drink." "No," she agreed, "but it tells us this. Someone was desperate to keep young Ned from inheriting, and desperate people rarely stop at forgery." Pike looked unconvinced. "Cecily seems a little brittle, sure, but poison?" Miss Marple tilted her head. "Not poison, exactly. Chlorodyne is legal. In the wrong dosage, combined with alcohol and age, it simply tips the balance. You think she dosed him herself?" Miss Marple didn't answer. Who had access to his nightcap that evening? Pike opened his mouth, then paused. "You mean besides Ned?" Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Yes, because Ned didn't bring the final glass." As twilight fell, the vicarage garden grew, quiet save for the distant rustle of leaves and the low murmur of voices from inside. Miss Marple, invited for supper, sipped her tea in the drawing-room, while Reverend Mallow fetched the dessert tray. He returned with fruit pudding, and a curious look on his face. "I'd forgotten something strange until today," he said, "about the Colonel." "Oh?" The day before the supper, he left something at the church, an envelope with hymn selections for the choir. But it wasn't just hymns. Miss Marple looked up. There was a page folded inside, a copy of his will. A note to me, asking if I'd witness it the following Monday. He blinked. "I'd meant to say something, but with the service today—" "And where is it now?" "I gave it back." He laughed and said he'd changed his mind about that version. "But someone else might have seen it," Miss Marple murmured. "Someone in the choir, perhaps." That night, Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the church. With the vicar's permission, she let herself into the vestry and opened the cabinet where service notes were stored. She flipped through a stack of folded papers, programs, and receipts, until her fingers brushed something wedged between the pages of the hymnal companion, a sheet of paper, slightly crumpled, water-stained. It was dated and signed in shaky handwriting. "I revoke all previous wills and hereby name Edward Blackthorne as sole beneficiary. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and returned it to its place. For now. Miss Marple stepped into the cold nave, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. Something deeper than mischief had been at play. The will had been hidden, yes, but the method was too subtle for mere financial gain. This was about silence, a silence that only one person had a reason to enforce. On her walk home, Miss Marple passed the Blackthorne house just as Ned emerged from the gate. "Miss Marple," he called, surprised. I was just heading to the vicarage." "I've already been," she said. "I found what I needed." Ned stepped closer, eyes dark. "Was there a will?" "There was," she said gently. "But it wasn't just the inheritance that made someone act. It was the threat of a truth resurfacing." Ned's voice tightened. "My aunt," Miss Marple took a breath. "Tell me honestly, Ned, did your uncle, Cecily's late husband, truly die of fever in Calcutta?" Ned hesitated. Then he shook his head. "I don't know what happened, but I remember the day my father received the telegram. He looked gutted, like something wasn't right. He never spoke of it again." Miss Marple nodded. "Sometimes guilt travels across oceans. But the dead don't write letters. Only the living try to silence what might be spoken." Ned looked away. "Do you think she—" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that the past left an open wound, and your uncle, Colonel Erskine, was about to tear off the bandage." As she turned the final corner toward her cottage, the breeze stirred through the hedgerows. In her mind, the web was nearly woven. A red scarf in the dark, a hidden will among hymns, a nightcap no one remembers handing over, a note without a name, and a voice that trembled only when forced to sing. But still, Miss Marple thought, there was one thread yet untouched, something small, something quiet. She would find it, and then she would pull. Chapter 5. By Saturday morning, the village was beginning to settle once more, as if it had collectively decided that morning, like rain, must eventually pass. But for Miss Marple, the weather remained unsettled. Too many clouds hung low, obscuring motives and movements behind polite words. In her parlour, the tea sat untouched. Before her, on the arm of the floral chair, lay a simple length of red wool, no longer than a finger. It had come loose from the fringe of a scarf found behind the rose trellis, discovered early that morning by Mrs. Dearling while trimming back the growth. Miss Marple turned it gently between her fingers. The wool was coarse, too rough for a lady's accessory. Not something Cecily Blackthorne would wear, certainly. But someone had worn it, someone unafraid to be seen that night, or perhaps too hurried to care. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, rising as her guest stepped inside. It was Inspector Fallow, sent from the county constabulary, following the whispers of poison and wills that Chipping Dean could no longer ignore. A man of middling height with careful posture and an expression that preferred facts to speculation. "Miss Marple," he greeted cordially. "I've been advised you've taken an interest." "I find murder rather insists upon interest, Inspector," she replied. He gave a short chuckle. "And what have you found?" She handed him the red thread. "Not much, I'm afraid. except that someone moved through Colonel Erskine's garden that night in a scarf too bright for discretion, and left it behind. He examined it. Wool. Men's scarf, I'd wager. Quite, she said, and not Ned's. He wore a grey cravat that evening, nor the Colonel's. His was silk. Fallow looked at her closely. So someone else was there. Yes, Miss Marple said, someone unexpected, and I believe I know where to find the rest of the scarf. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the village laundry, operated by the thin-lipped and eternally suspicious Miss Cora Pegg, who knew every hemline and collar in Chipping Dean. Miss Marple entered just as Cora was sorting through a rack of pressed garments. "Jane," Cora said without looking up, "you're early for Tuesday." "Just browsing," Miss Marple replied with a light smile, eyes already scanning the hanging items. "I wondered if you'd had anything in recently that smelled strongly of cigar smoke." Cora raised an eyebrow. "That old Colonel reeked of it. I had to soak his jackets twice over." "Anything unusual this week?" Cora hesitated, then pulled aside a linen sheet to reveal a crimson wool scarf draped over a drying bar. One end had been hastily mended, the other slightly frayed. "Found this wrapped around a pair of trousers. No tag. No one's claimed it." Miss Marple reached forward and ran a finger along the stitching. "Rough wool. Amateur repair. Was it blood-stained?" "Bit of brown on the fringe," Cora said. "Could be wine. Could be worse." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I suspect worse." By evening, the web Miss Marple had been spinning in her mind was no longer thread. It was fabric. She invited Reverend Mallow for supper. A simple meal, boiled potatoes, smoked fish, and quiet talk. As they finished the last of the bread pudding, Miss Marple leaned forward, tone conversational. "You knew Colonel Erskine in his youth, did you not?" The vicar nodded, briefly, before he went abroad. "Did he have enemies here, even then?" "Not enemies," the vicar said slowly, "but he was cruel with his words. Never forgot a slight. Held others to account, but never himself. Would you say he blackmailed anyone?" The vicar blinked. "That's a strong word, but accurate?" He sighed. "There were rumours. Even in Calcutta, his name carried a certain weight. There was a scandal involving a trading firm. Something about falsified accounts. A junior clerk was blamed, but—" He shook his head. "Some say Erskine orchestrated the whole thing and let another take the fall." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "Do you recall the clerk's name?" Mallow paused. "Randolph. William Randolph." She said nothing, but she was already standing, already reaching for the letter tucked in her drawer. The handwriting on the note, the one that read, "He said, if I don't come forward, he will," had been puzzling. It was careful, deliberate. Someone hiding their hand, but Miss Marple had seen it before. In the parish newsletter, at the bottom of the choir list. She returned to the church that night, carrying the note with her. Inside the vestry, she found the list from last week's practice. The handwriting matched exactly. William Randolph had lived in Chipping Dean for 2 years, under a new name, William Redford. He sang baritone, kept to himself. No one asked questions. No one had reason to, until now. Sunday morning brought clouds, not rain, but a sky grey enough to feel like waiting. Miss Marple stood just outside the churchyard as William Redford, tall, angular, neatly dressed, stepped out of the vestry after rehearsal. She spoke quietly. "You knew him, didn't you?" Turned. "Pardon? Colonel Erskine. You knew him in India?" Redford's face froze. I don't know what you mean." "You were the clerk who took the fall." His jaw clenched. "That was a long time ago." "But he didn't forget, and neither did you. He was silent. You wrote the note, the one that said he threatened to reveal your past. But it wasn't a threat, was it? He meant to discredit you before you could rebuild, before you could matter." Still nothing. Miss Marple looked at him, soft yet unyielding. "Did you mean to kill him, Mr. Redford?" A long breath. "No," he said. "I wanted to scare him. I wanted him to stop. But you didn't give him the drink?" He shook his head. "No," he said again. "But I saw who did." Miss Marple waited. He looked up. It was Cecily. She brought it from the kitchen herself. I saw her carry it across the garden, wrapped in a towel. She thought no one was watching. Miss Marple nodded once. That, at last, was the thread she'd needed. Chapter 6. Sunday passed not with the usual tranquillity of church and pudding, but with a peculiar quiet, heavy and watchful, the kind of silence that followed a collective holding of breath. By evening, the sky pressed low, and the first signs of rain dusted the windows of Miss Marple's cottage. She sat by the fireplace, not knitting as usual, but rereading William, Redford's confession, brief, verbal, and heavy with withheld emotion. He hadn't murdered Colonel Erskine, but he'd seen the moment the trap was set, and now Miss Marple knew the shape of the truth. But one piece remained out of place. Cecily. Blackthorne had delivered the nightcap. Redford had seen it. The Colonel had been dosed with chlorodyne, a drug he hadn't touched in months. The updated will had been hidden in the hymnal, and the only person who had access to all of it, private space, medication, knowledge of the past, was Cecily. Still, Miss Marple did not move, because intent was not the same as proof. And there was still something the Colonel had intended to reveal, something beyond the will. Something that had made Cecily risk everything to stop him. Early Monday morning, Miss Marple returned to the Colonel's cottage. Rain clung to her umbrella in soft plinks as she stepped around the back gate, which remained unlocked even now. The rose arbour was slick with dew, but she didn't linger there. She headed straight for the study. Sergeant Pike was there already, inventorying the remaining contents of the desk. "Back again, Miss Marple?" he asked, surprised. "I've a question, Sergeant," she said, scanning the room. "Has anyone searched the mantel clock?" He frowned. "The clock? I can't say we've looked inside it. Would you mind opening it for me?" With a shrug, Pike unlatched the small brass door beneath the clock face and peered inside. "There's something here," he muttered, pulling out a folded sheet of stationery. Miss Marple took it gently. It was sealed, barely. A half-dried wax blotch held it shut. The Colonel's crest pressed faintly into it. The paper crackled as she opened it. There, in tight, slanted hand, "If anything happens to me, look to Cecily. Blackthorne. She fears the truth from India. Ask about the man she left behind. This letter is my final word, should I be silenced." Lucius Erskine Miss Marple let out a slow breath. Now it was complete. The rain tapered off by midday. Overhead, the clouds lifted, but the air remained cool and damp. The village seemed unaware that the shape of its story had changed. Miss Marple stopped by the post office, where Miss Fernie handed her a telegram with shaking fingers. "It's from Dorset," she said. "The Colonel's cousin. Said he's given up the claim. Doesn't want to stir trouble." Miss Marple read it with polite detachment. She already knew he'd step aside. The burned will had been his undoing, and perhaps his deliverance. "Anything else today?" she asked. Miss Fernie hesitated, then said, "Cecily Blackthorne sent a letter this morning. Registered. Destination, Calcutta." Miss Marple raised a brow. "To whom?" "No name, just initials." "PRM." A long pause. Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "I think it's time I paid her a visit." The Blackthorne home was quiet. Ned was out, at the vicarage, she guessed, and Cecily answered the door herself. Her expression didn't shift at the sight of Miss Marple, though her grip on the doorframe tightened ever so slightly. "Miss Marple," she said, "what brings you by?" "Tea," Miss Marple said sweetly. "And unfinished business." Reluctantly, Cecily let her in. The parlour was too warm, the curtains drawn tight despite the rain having cleared. On the table sat a teacup, half full. Its rim bore a faint trace of lipstick. Red, too dark for Cecily's usual shade. Miss Marple sat without invitation, folding her gloves neatly on her lap. "I imagine you know why I'm here." Cecily didn't answer. "The Colonel's letter," Miss Marple continued softly, "found in the clock. His final word." Still silence. Miss Marple looked at her, truly looked at her. "You were in love with someone in India," she said. "Not your husband, a man who vanished, who was presumed dead in a fire. A man who wasn't supposed to be there the night of the explosion." Cecily's breath caught. Lucius Erskine knew. He hinted at it that evening, called you by your maiden name, said things that only someone from those years would remember. Still, Cecily didn't speak. You left your lover behind, abandoned him to preserve your marriage, and he died, or so you believed. But the Colonel knew the truth, that he survived, that he later took his own life, and that a letter, his final letter, was sent, a letter that you intercepted. At last, Cecily's voice cracked. "I was trying to rebuild, to forget." Miss Marple leaned in, her voice calm and measured. "But Lucius wouldn't let you. He threatened to expose it, not out of justice, but revenge. He wanted to destroy what little peace you had left." Cecily turned away. "He said if I didn't give him what he wanted, my land, my silence, he'd go to the papers." "And so," Miss Marple said, "you did what you believed you had to do." "I didn't mean to kill him," Cecily whispered. "Just to calm him. I used a drop, just a drop in his brandy." "But his heart couldn't take it," Miss Marple finished. There was no rage in Cecily, no hysteria, just the quiet of someone who had already stood at the gallows in her mind. "I'll confess," she said. Miss Marple shook her head. "Not to me." Sergeant Pike arrested Cecily Blackthorne that same afternoon. She did not struggle. She did not cry. She walked with quiet dignity into the police car, her eyes forward. William Redford watched from the corner by the grocer's, his face unreadable. He said nothing and slipped away before anyone noticed. Ned Blackthorne stood outside, the vicarage hands in his coat pockets as the car passed. Miss Marple joined him. She did it to protect the illusion, she said softly. She didn't trust the village to forgive her, Ned said, or herself. She feared judgment more than guilt, Miss Marple agreed, as many do. Ned nodded. I'll stay. Take the house. Start again. She placed a hand gently on his arm. That would be the right thing. That evening, Miss Marple sat once more by her fire. The red woolen thread lay now in a small box marked Curiosities. The Colonel's final letter was sealed in the constable's evidence file. The will had been notarized. The estate passed legally to Ned to Justice was quiet, but complete. Outside, the night returned to stillness. No secrets moved behind drawn curtains. No red scarves darted past garden hedges. And in her chair, Miss Marple finally picked up her knitting. The pattern was simple, but the mistakes always lay in the quietest stitches. Chapter 7. Monday night descended over Chipping Dean, not with a sense of closure, but with something more ambiguous, like a room where the windows had been shut too tightly. Cecily Blackthorne had confessed. Her name would be in the papers, and yet for Miss Marple something continued to press quietly against her mind, like a curtain shifting without a breeze. The case was solved, but it wasn't complete. She sat in her parlour, the fire throwing a wavering light across the rug, and reviewed her notes. Cecily's motive clear, her opportunity documented, her knowledge of the Colonel's habits beyond question. And yet a singular thing returned to her like a wrinkle in a pressed dress. Cecily hadn't known about the will hidden in the hymnal. She had gone through extraordinary trouble to silence the Colonel for fear of his accusations, and perhaps even to prevent a scandal. But the will, she had never asked about it, never reacted when it surfaced, never once tried to retrieve it, which meant she never expected it to exist. The next morning brought a visitor. Ned Blackthorne, in a dark overcoat and a quiet expression, appeared at Miss Marple's garden gate just past 9. "Miss Marple," he said, "may I?" She waved him in, setting aside her cup of tea. "I've just come from the solicitors," Ned said as he sat. "They've confirmed everything, the will, the hand, the date. It's valid. I'm the sole heir." Miss Marple offered a smile, though her eyes held him longer than necessary. "You sound as if you expected it." He gave a half shrug. "I suppose I did. Uncle Lucius told me more than once that I'd get it all. He said he didn't trust anyone else with it." "You mean Cecily?" "I mean everyone," Ned said. "He didn't believe in institutions, or in trust." Miss Marple folded her hands. "He trusted you." Ned's brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Miss Marple leaned forward. "Tell me again, Ned, who poured the final drink?" He hesitated. "I don't know. I thought it was Aunt Cecily, but—" "But William Redford said he saw her carry the glass," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "Yet when he described her, he mentioned a scarf, a red wool scarf." Ned looked puzzled. "She doesn't own one," Miss Marple continued. "But you do." Silence stretched. Miss Marple stood and crossed to the sideboard. She returned with a box, the one marked Curiosities. From it she retrieved the coarse red thread. This was found in the rose trellis. The same thread as the scarf sent to the village laundry, wrapped in trousers that matched yours. You visited your uncle that night, alone, after Cecily had gone home. Ned's face had gone pale. That's not true. Isn't it? Miss Marple said softly. You said you left him in the arbour after giving him his drink, but Cecily never brought him the glass. You did. You knew he was drinking that night. You knew his habits. Ned swallowed. He threatened her. Yes, she said, but not just her. He threatened you, too. She moved closer, her tone still kind, still unjudging. You'd seen the will, the one he tucked in the hymnal. You found it before the service. Maybe he told you himself, or maybe you stumbled across it. Either way, you realized what he was planning to do. Perhaps you were already afraid he'd change his mind. Perhaps you thought he'd give it all to Cecily after all. Ned's voice came small and cracked. He said I was weak, that I wasn't man enough to run the estate, that he'd undo the will if I didn't do something with myself. And so, Miss Marple said, you did. The truth fell out slowly. Ned had found the chlorodyne weeks earlier, forgotten in the back of a cabinet. He didn't intend to kill, only to frighten. He poured a small amount into the nightcap and delivered it just after Cecily's argument with the Colonel, knowing she would be the first suspect if anything went wrong. He hadn't expected death, only collapse, a scare. Enough to remind the Colonel who truly mattered, but the heart gave out, and the deed was done. When the news spread that Cecily had been seen arguing with the Colonel, Ned said nothing. When she was arrested, he said even less. I didn't mean to, Ned said brokenly, but she was willing to take the blame. She thought it would shield you, Miss Marple replied. Even now, she believes she deserves it. By noon, Sergeant Pike had taken Ned into custody. His confession was complete, delivered with resignation. Cecily was released from her cell. No charges would be filed. Miss Marple saw to that. A misunderstanding, they called it. A protective lie. The village, of course, would buzz with speculation for weeks. But by the time summer fully arrived, the story would soften into rumour, and rumour into silence. Miss Marple visited Cecily that evening. They sat in silence for several minutes, tea cooling between them. He's not a killer, Cecily finally said. No, Miss Marple agreed, just a frightened young man. And frightened people make dangerous choices. Cecily looked away. He's lost everything now. Not everything, Miss Marple said. He still has the truth, and that can be more powerful than an inheritance. That night, Chipping Dean returned to its rhythm. Church bells, late post, shuttered windows. But behind the drawn curtains and polite smiles, a new story had settled into the village's bones, one of pride, protection, and the unexpected ways love can turn to fear. Miss Marple sat by her window, hands finally at rest. The knitting lay untouched. This time, there were no mistakes in the pattern, just the knowledge that nothing, neither will, nor whine, nor whisper, could stay hidden forever. Chapter 8. Tuesday brought sunlight for the first time in a week. The village seemed to breathe again. Clotheslines sagged with drying linens, and the vicar's roses turned their heads toward the sky. But beneath that brightness, a peculiar hush lingered. Everyone in Chipping Dean knew the case of Colonel Erskine's death was closed, and yet no one quite said it aloud. Miss Marple stood at her garden gate with pruning shears in hand, watching the postman pedal past. Her thoughts were not on perennials. A case like this, quietly layered, steeped in secrets left behind echoes, and while the killer had confessed, while the motives had been unwrapped and gently laid bare, there remained one final matter still not spoken of. What exactly had Colonel Erskine meant to reveal? She hadn't shared it, not even with the inspector, but she had her suspicions. Not only about Cecily's past in India, but about something else. A private letter Colonel Erskine had once mentioned in the days before his death, a letter that had never been found. And in Miss Marple's experience, letters did not simply vanish, especially not in tidy English gardens. By mid-morning, she was walking again toward the Colonel's cottage. It was locked now, pending estate transfer, but Miss Marple had arranged with Sergeant Pike to borrow the key. A final inspection, she'd said, with that mild smile of hers that made denial nearly impossible. The garden was overgrown. Weeds crept into the cracks of the path, and the arbour, so central to the murder, stood quiet, almost untouched. She stepped beneath its arch and stood for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the light. The chair had been removed, but the faint outline of its legs remained in the flattened grass. She crouched down, brushing a hand through the undergrowth, and there, beneath a slab of dislodged paving, was a glint of copper. Miss Marple pulled gently. A metal tin, weathered, unlocked, inside, 2 folded letters, one brittle with age, the other sealed with fresh wax. Her fingers trembled slightly as she lifted the newer one. It bore no address, only a single word, confession. That afternoon Miss Marple sat once more with Inspector Fallow. The letter laid between them on his desk, he read in silence, brows tightening with each line. When he finished, he leaned back, so Cecily was never the true focus of his threat. Miss Marple nodded. No, she was leverage. He knew Ned had found the will. He knew the boy was afraid of being disinherited. Lucius used that fear, goaded him, knowing he might act. Manipulation, the inspector murmured. Calculated. He wanted to provoke a response, something to confirm his power. But I don't believe he expected to die. I believe he thought Ned would confront him, or even destroy the will, and in doing so, leave himself vulnerable. Fallow tapped a finger on the desk. Instead, the lad panicked and overstepped. Miss Marple sipped her tea. Yes, which made Cecily's false confession all the more tragic. She didn't know Ned had acted, but she feared the consequences, enough to believe he might have. Fallow exhaled. So, in the end, it wasn't the secrets from India that killed the Colonel. No, Miss Marple said softly. It was the fear of them, and the man's delight in reminding others of what they'd rather forget. That evening, Ned Blackthorne sat alone in his holding cell. The full confession read aloud to him by the inspector. He made no denial. He simply sat, head bowed, and listened. When they left him, Miss Marple remained behind for a moment. I knew, he said quietly, that he kept things hidden. But I didn't know about that letter. Miss Marple stood just beyond the bars. Your uncle knew how to use fear. He planted it like a gardener, watered it, watched it grow. Ned didn't look up. I didn't mean to kill him. I believe you, she said, but intention cannot undo action. And silence, when paired with guilt, is its own kind of poison. He looked at her then. Will I go to prison? For a time, she said, but you'll come out, and when you do, you must live differently. No more waiting for other people to decide who you are. He nodded slowly, and Miss Marple turned to leave. The next day, Sergeant Pike came to deliver a small parcel. Inside it was the older letter found in the tin, dated nearly 20 years back. It had never been sent. Miss Marple read it in her parlour, rain falling softly beyond the window. It was from Cecily's lover in India, a man named Pratap Mehra. I do not blame you. I never did. You made a choice you believed you had to make. But know this, I survived, and I forgave you. I returned to England under another name. I lived near London. I watched you marry again, and I watched you grieve. If you ever wish to see me, write to the old address in Calcutta. The mail will find me. Miss Marple folded the letter gently and placed it in a small wooden box alongside the red thread and the Colonel's clock key. So that was the final cruelty. Cecily had believed for years that her lover had died, and Lucius Erskine had known the truth. He'd kept the letter, hidden it, not to shield her, but to wound her at the moment of his choosing. But he hadn't lived long enough to do so, and perhaps that, Miss Marple thought, was the closest thing to justice the Colonel would ever know. In the final days of spring, chipping, Dean settled into peace once more. Cecily sold the house and left without ceremony, retreating to her sisters in the Lake District. The Colonel was buried with full honours, though few attended the graveside. Ned remained in custody, awaiting sentencing. Miss Marple tended to her garden. The roses were late that year, but she did not mind. In time, all things bloom, even the buried ones. Chapter 9. A week had passed since the last official statement was made regarding Colonel Erskine's death. The newspapers had picked up the story, of course, but only in the gentlest of ways. An unexpected death in a quiet English village, with a delicate legal matter soon resolved. No mention of chlorodyne. No mention of a forged scarf or a confession misled by guilt. That was how such matters were handled in Chipping Dean, with veils, with euphemism, with the past swept politely under the carpet, provided the carpet wasn't too thoroughly inspected. But Miss Marple, of course, did inspect carpets, both literal and metaphorical. She knew the case had reached its legal conclusion, but human nature did not obey the structure of trials and judgments. It lingered, echoed, shifted in shadow, and in Chipping Dean, shadows always clung to the corners of good drawing-rooms. On Thursday afternoon, Miss Marple took tea with Reverend Mallow on the church lawn, beneath the beech tree that had seen 2 generations of village baptisms and at least 1 discreet elopement. Cecily wrote, the Reverend said, stirring sugar into his cup. Says she's taken up reading again. Gardening a little. She sounds worn, but not broken. I don't imagine she will ever break, Miss Marple said. Not in the way people expect. But there are other kinds of fractures. Loved the boy, Mallow said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. so much that she was willing to be condemned for him, but not so much that she could see the danger in shielding him too long. The Reverend sighed, his gaze drifting towards the war memorial. "Do you think," he asked, "that people are born with guilt, or do they grow it themselves?" "Neither," Miss Marple said after a moment. "I think people choose how much guilt they're willing to carry, and whether to carry it in silence or in truth." That same evening, Miss Marple received a letter, no return address, only a faint postmark from London. She opened it carefully, her fingertips brushing paper she somehow knew would be final. "Miss Marple, I don't expect forgiveness, and I certainly don't deserve it. But you must understand something. He ruined people for pleasure. He enjoyed watching others squirm under the weight of their own shame. He was cruel, not in a loud way, but in that quiet, calculating way that makes you doubt yourself completely. I was weak. I still am. But I want to thank you, not for saving me, but for unmasking him. That was something none of us ever managed, not even Cecily. I'll serve my time. Then I'll disappear. Please don't write back." And Miss Marple folded the letter gently and placed it in her fireplace box. She did not burn it. Not yet. Some words deserved to sit in silence for a while. The following morning brought a visit from Mr. Cuthbert Lee, the solicitor, who arrived bearing a slim envelope and a puzzled look. "It was in the back of the Colonel's bookcase," he said, "behind a false panel. I found it while overseeing the estate inventory." Miss Marple opened the envelope and found a photograph inside. A man in a British colonial uniform stood beside a younger woman in a wide-brimmed hat. Cecily, unmistakably. Between them, smiling with a quiet sort of pride, stood a third man. William Redford, the man who had once been Pratap Mehra's roommate, and possibly, Miss Marple now considered, the only person who had truly known both halves of the story. On the back of the photograph, a short message in faded ink. "Some truths can only survive in silence." Miss Marple placed the photograph beside the note from Cecily's lover. Between them, a bridge spanned years and continents, Calcutta to Chipping Dean. A web of betrayal, survival, silence, and the damage done by one man's pleasure in manipulation. Later, that day, she returned the photograph to Cecily by post. No note, no explanation, just the truth quietly offered. Cecily would understand, and in understanding, perhaps she would finally allow herself to grieve. Not only the Colonel, or the life she had lost, but the version of herself that had been so long confined by shame. By Sunday, the last of the Colonel's belongings had been cleared from the cottage. It would be sold, most likely to an outsider who'd never know the rose arbour's shadowed history. The village would go on, slowly erasing the traces of the scandal with polite distractions. But Miss Marple kept one item. A glass tumbler etched with the Erskine crest. It had been found behind the rhododendrons, long after the police had finished their search. It wasn't the Nightcap glass. The real one had gone missing, but this had once been part of a set. She kept it not as a trophy, but as a reminder that justice was rarely perfect, that truth was rarely complete, but that silence, when left to fester, always became its own form of violence. That evening, Miss Marple returned to her knitting chair. The pattern was half finished, neatly stitched, no knots. She picked up the needles and worked in silence, the fire flickering beside her, the rhythm of the yarn steady and sure. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees. Somewhere across the village, a child laughed. A dog barked, and far away, beyond, the hills and the narrow lanes, a letter posted to Calcutta finally arrived at its quiet destination, unopened, but not unread. Chapter 10. 2 weeks had passed since Miss Marple had read the final letter, and in that time Chipping Dean had moved on. The rain had cleared, and the summer sun warmed the village streets, drawing children out to the green and making the air smell of grass and distant flowers. But for Miss Marple, the season was as much about endings as beginnings. She had written to Cecily. A simple note, nothing too invasive. Just a kind gesture, an acknowledgement of the difficult road ahead. There had been no reply, but Miss Marple had expected none. It was a Monday afternoon when Sergeant Pike arrived at her cottage. The news had already started to settle into gossip, and it was clear from the moment he entered that the last chapter of the Erskine case was yet to be fully closed. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tinged with hesitation, "I need to ask you something." Miss Marple set her teacup down. "Of course, Sergeant. What's troubling you?" "It's about William Redford. That's what he's calling himself now, anyway." He paused, then added with a touch of disbelief, "It seems he's disappeared." "Disappeared," Miss Marple echoed, her voice calm. "He left London for a ship heading to India. His landlord hasn't seen him since Saturday, and his room's cleared out, just gone, like he never existed." Miss Marple remained still, eyes thoughtful. "You're saying he's left for good, then?" "Not just left, Miss Marple. There's a small fortune missing from his accounts. The man was involved in a few dealings here in the village, small loans, odd transactions, and all of it's gone now, as if he planned it." Miss Marple placed her hand on the table, the quiet click of her fingers tapping against the wood. "I think it's time we finish this story." The following morning, Miss Marple made her way to the constabulary, accompanied by Sergeant Pike. It was a brisk walk, the morning sun casting long shadows along the street, but Miss Marple's mind was already far ahead of her feet. When they arrived, she made her way directly to the back office, where Inspector Fallow had been waiting, a file in front of him that had likely been opened more than once in the past few days. "Miss Marple, Pike, please sit," the inspector said, gesturing toward the chairs. "I've been reviewing Redford's records and following up on some leads. I think I've uncovered something interesting, but I need your perspective." Miss Marple sat, smoothing her shawl. "Go ahead, Inspector. I went through Redford's finances. He never came clean about his past in India. It seems he's had multiple aliases, always linked back to a certain accident. One that never quite added up. A fire at a trading post. A fatal fire, he claimed. Say?" Marple's eyes sharpened. "Yet, when I found a document hidden in his most recent files, it revealed something else. Something he tried to hide from everyone, including me." Fallow opened the file and slid a piece of paper toward Miss Marple. "This," he said, "is a photograph of Redford from his days in India, before the fire. And you'll notice something unusual in this picture." Miss Marple studied the photograph carefully. The man was younger, no more than 25, standing alongside a group of local workers, holding a shovel looking much like any young man abroad. But then she spotted it. A scar, a small burn mark, right across the back of his neck. "It matches a description in his medical records," Fallow said quietly. "And this is what changes everything." Miss Marple glanced up from the photograph. "Explain." "The man who died in that fire wasn't Redford. It wasn't even Pratap Mehra. It was a third person entirely. A man who had known too much about Mehra's death and his ties to Colonel Erskine. A man who threatened to expose them both." Miss Marple leaned back, digesting the information. "And Redford, or Mehra, switched identities using the fire as cover?" "Exactly. But here's the most troubling part. Redford, the man who gave himself that new name, wasn't just hiding from the past. He was keeping an old secret hidden. A secret that, once uncovered, would lead straight back to the Colonel. It all clicked into place just a moment later." Miss Marple stood, her hand steady as she adjusted her shawl. "It was never about the estate," she said softly. "Cecily didn't have to die. She only thought she had to. The real motivation was this: the Colonel's past, and the danger of what he knew about Redford. He wanted to ruin her, remind her of her former guilt, but he didn't count on her covering for her nephew." Fallow stood as well. "So what now, Miss Marple?" "It's not finished," she said with quiet finality. "There's one last step." That evening Miss Marple walked to the Blackthorn house. She had not seen Cecily since the arrest, nor had she expected to. But now, with the final pieces of the puzzle clicking together, she knew it was time to offer her final observation. She was greeted by Ned Blackthorn, whose face showed the wear of a young man unsure of his place in the world. "I wasn't expecting you," he said, standing in the doorway. "I know. I need to speak with Cecily." Ned hesitated but stepped aside. "She's been quieter than usual. You might need to remind her of something." Cecily was sitting in the parlour, staring at the window, the dim light catching the edges of her face as she watched the distant hills. She didn't look up when Miss Marple entered. "I imagine you've been thinking," Miss Marple said quietly, sitting across from her. Cecily's fingers twisted the lace of her shawl. "Thinking of what?" "About the past," Miss Marple said softly. "About a time when you weren't afraid." "Afraid?" Cecily laughed bitterly. "I was always afraid, but not for the reasons everyone assumes. Not for my own guilt, but for what it meant to be trapped, what it meant to be forgotten." Miss Marple leaned forward. "But you're not forgotten. Not to me, and not to him." She reached into her bag, pulling out the photograph of Redford. Mehra, really. The man who had died years ago, and the man who had wanted to leave the past in ashes. Cecily looked at the photograph, her face pale. "I never knew. Not until you said it. He never told me. He wanted me to think it was all over. And so it was," Miss Marple said, voice quiet but firm, "but not until the truth came to light. The village would forget the scandal soon enough, as it always did. Life would return to its slow rhythm, the same way it always did after an old story was buried. But Miss Marple knew better. She knew the truth had been buried with it, and some things, like guilt, never really fade. And so she finally folded the last of her notes into an envelope, sealed it with care, and sent it to a place far from Chipping Dean, Not for the village, but for the people who had lived there once. Chapter 11. The village was quiet now, not merely in the manner of one whose troubles have been settled, but in a way that suggested a new unease. It was the last lingering remnants of a storm that had passed through, a thunderous secret finally disclosed, leaving only the stillness behind it. Miss Marple walked across the garden of her cottage, the sun low and golden. The roses she had been tending were beginning to bloom again, full and bright despite the earlier rains. She paused, her gaze drawn to the far corner where a patch of wild flowers had recently grown. There, amongst the greenery, something caught her eye. A letter, crumpled but still partially intact. It was a fresh note, not one she had expected to find. She reached down and unfolded it carefully, her hands steady, even as the meaning became clear. I couldn't leave things as they are. You deserve to know the truth, even if it causes more trouble. I've left. Please don't look for me. Fusie. Cecily. Miss Marple held the letter for a moment longer than necessary, then folded it and tucked it into her coat pocket. She had known there would be more. A final piece, one last choice, made by a woman who had spent her life trying to outrun the shadow of an unforgiving past. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple sat in her parlour, reflecting on the events that had transpired over the past few weeks. The Blackthorn family was as fractured as it had ever been. Cecily was gone, perhaps permanently, though Miss Marple suspected she would return when she could no longer escape the weight of her actions. Ned, though unburdened by the crime itself, would carry the shame of his family's secrets for the rest of his life. But there was something else, a quiet tension between them all, one that had not quite been resolved. Miss Marple reached for her knitting, her fingers moving with practised ease as her mind wandered back to the night of the garden party. She had seen it then, the way things never quite fit together, the unspoken conversations that fluttered like moths just out of reach. She had wondered then if the truth would come not from bold confessions or sudden revelations, but from the simplest of actions. It had. And now, in the stillness of the afternoon, Miss Marple thought she might be finished. There was no more to untangle, no more webs to unwind. Her musings were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was a soft knock, but one that carried with it an unmistakable urgency. "Come in," Miss Marple called, setting aside her knitting with quiet precision. The door creaked open to reveal Sergeant Pike. His uniform was slightly dishevelled, and his expression was one of barely contained frustration. "Miss Marple," he said, stepping inside, I don't know how to say this." "You don't need to say it, Sergeant," Miss Marple said, rising and walking toward him. "I know you found something, and I think it's time we discuss it." Pike hesitated, but then nodded, producing a small bundle from his coat. "I've been going over everything, the paperwork. It wasn't until today that I realized something important. I found another letter, hidden in the same place as the one Redford had sent." Miss Marple took the letter from his hands. It was unsealed, crumpled in places as though it had been handled too many times, but the words, though smudged and uneven, were unmistakable. "I will leave soon, but when I do, I will make sure to leave my past where it belongs. Don't follow me, not for your sake, but for mine. I did what I had to do, but I will never forget him, nor you." The signature was a simple initial. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment. It was Cecily's handwriting once again, but this time it was different. There was no bitterness, no fear, just something that resembled resolve. Miss Marple had known it would come to this. Cecily's departure, her decision to leave the past behind and protect what little she could of her fractured life. Sergeant Pike watched her carefully, waiting for her to speak. "She's gone," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute. "Cecily is gone for good, I suspect, but she has made her choice." "Do you think she'll ever come back?" Pike asked, his tone heavy with the weight of unanswered questions. Miss Marple shook her head. "No, not unless it is to face what she has left behind. But it won't be to atone. Not for herself. For Ned." The sergeant nodded slowly, as though he understood her reasoning, but the weight of it seemed to sit heavier in his chest. "What about Redford?" Pike asked, his voice edged with the same confusion Miss Marple had felt earlier. "He's escaped, but why?" "Because Redford never intended to stay in one place for long. He wasn't hiding in plain sight. He was waiting," Miss Marple replied, her voice growing firmer. "He wasn't running from the law. He was running from himself, and from the truth. Now, though, I don't think he'll ever feel truly free. Not after the lies and deceit. He's just another shadow passing through history." Pike seemed to digest her words, his shoulders slumping with the realization that even with all the pieces of the puzzle before him, the true resolution was one that could never be fully seen. That evening, Miss Marple sat quietly, once again before the fire. The case was officially over, yet as she looked out the window into the dimming light, she knew that even in the quietest corners of this small village, the shadows of the past never fully left. Chipping Dean would go on, it always did, but the people who lived there and the secrets they carried would never be the same, and Miss Marple, as ever, would continue to watch, to listen, to notice when something didn't quite fit, because in her experience, there was no such thing as a complete end, there was only the next beginning. Chapter 12. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the last of the evening light soften the edges of Chipping Dean. The air was cool now, the scent of earth and grass mingling in the breeze. It was a village that, in its own way, thrived on secrets, so many little things that people thought no one would ever notice. And yet, Miss Marple noticed everything. The case of Colonel Erskine's death had drawn to a close with the arrest of Ned Blackthorne and Cecily Blackthorne's departure. There was no more to be said, it seemed. The truth had been unearthed, the people involved had been dealt with, and the village had returned to its quiet rhythm, as it always did after the storms. But Miss Marple knew better than to think that peace was permanent. The next morning, a letter arrived at Miss Marple's door. It was from the solicitor, Mr. Cuthbert Lee. She opened it, and as she read, her brow furrowed slightly. It seemed that despite the official resolution of the case, there was still a matter to be addressed. The estate of Colonel Erskine, it turned out, had never been fully settled. A clause in the original will, long overlooked, had come to light. And while it did not alter the inheritance of the Blackthorne family, it pointed to one last lingering thread. the one that had caused so much turmoil to begin with. The clause in question was simple, almost matter-of-fact, but it was the implications that were startling. After a brief breakfast, Miss Marple made her way to the solicitor's office. The sky was clear now, the village bathed in morning sunlight. The streets were bustling with the usual activity, but there was a certain stillness to everything, as though even the people walking to market knew something was unresolved. She was shown into Mr. Lee's office, where he was already waiting, his spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Miss Marple," he said with a smile, though it was tinged with something else, an unease that hadn't been there before. "I have some rather curious news." "What is it?" Miss Marple asked, sitting down across from him. Lee hesitated for a moment, then handed her a document. "This is a copy of the will I found," he said quietly. "It was hidden within the original papers, buried beneath other documents. It's rather unexpected." Miss Marple took the paper, her fingers tracing the neat handwriting. It was signed, dated, and witnessed by none other than William Redford. The document was brief but clear. "Should anything happen to me, I wish for my estate to be divided between two people, Cecily Blackthorne and a man named William Redford, under the condition that my affairs are never made public. My estate, including all investments and holdings, will remain private and confidential until the time of my passing. If I do not live to see the distribution, I give my power of decision to Cecily, who will decide on behalf of both." Miss Marple lowered the document, her thoughts spinning. "Redford?" she said softly. "But that name—" "It's the man known as Pratap Mehra, or William Redford, as he chose to call himself here," Lee explained. "What surprises me is that Colonel Erskine never mentioned him in his public will. It seems he believed his dealings with Mehra, or Redford, were tied to his personal rather than professional matters." Miss Marple remained silent, digesting the implications of the clause. Redford had been more than a mere accomplice to the Blackthorns' tragedy. He had been part of the very foundation of the Colonel's downfall. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the fire casting a warm glow across her face. The latest discovery had shifted something that had been lying beneath the surface all along. The case, it seemed, had never been as neatly finished as it appeared. Even though Cecily had left, even though Ned was in custody, there remained one final question. Why had Redford, or Mehra, become so deeply entwined with the Blackthorn family's past? And why, after all these years, had Colonel Erskine felt compelled to shield him, even to the point of secrecy? As Miss Marple considered the possibilities, a knock came at the door. She rose, her feet moving with quiet purpose, and opened it to find Sergeant Pike standing there, holding a small package. "This arrived for you, Miss Marple," he said, offering it with a solemn expression. She took the package, unwrapping it carefully. Inside, nestled between layers of tissue, was another letter. This one was much older, and the handwriting was unmistakable. It was from Pratap Mehra. "If you find this, you will understand. The deal was made long ago when I was a young man, desperate for escape. I did what I had to do. I crossed boundaries, forged ties that were never meant to be. Colonel Erskine saved me from death. But he never asked me to return the favour. He believed that secrets were meant to be protected. He believed that guilt could be washed away with time. But time doesn't erase the stains of a man's soul. It only hides them deeper. The letter ended abruptly. The rest of the words smudged as though the ink had run, or the letter had been hastily discarded. Miss Marple read it again, her mind piecing together the fragments. It was no longer just a case of inheritance. It was a case of survival, of choices made in desperation, and of the weight of secrets that never let go. The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, where the memorial for Colonel Erskine was being prepared. The sun had risen early, and the village was already gathering. But Miss Marple knew that this would be the last time the name of the Colonel would be spoken aloud in Chipping Dean. As she walked, she realized that the truth had always been just out of reach. It had been waiting, buried in the layers of history, just as Mera had been buried. The final letter was the last stitch in the unraveling pattern of a life full of deception, but even now it felt incomplete. Still, she smiled. Some mysteries, she knew, would never fully end, and perhaps that was for the best. Chapter 13. Chipping Dean, for all its charm, had grown quiet again, as it always did after a storm. The clouds had cleared, the sun returned, and the village resumed its easy rhythm. But Miss Marple knew that, sometimes, even after the rain had passed, the scent of the earth lingered a bit longer, and the ground remained damp, just beneath the surface. It had been nearly a month since Colonel Erskine's death, and in that time the lives of the Blackthorns had been irrevocably altered. Cecily was gone. Miss Marple suspected to an uncertain fate, far from the memories of Chipping Dean. Ned, still in custody, awaited his trial. As for the villagers, they had quietly begun to forget. The murder was no longer a talking point at market or over tea. But Miss Marple had learned long ago that the quietest of villages often hid the deepest of truths. It was on a late afternoon, as the shadows stretched across the lawn of her cottage, that the doorbell rang. A soft, insistent sound, one that suggested a visitor who had thought long before seeking her out. Miss Marple rose from her chair and opened the door to find Sergeant Pike once more standing in her doorway, holding a small bundle in his hands. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice even more subdued than usual, "I think this belongs to you." He handed her the package, wrapped in brown paper. It was no larger than a book, though the way Pike held it made it clear that it was something more delicate. She accepted it, her curiosity piqued, and then he hesitated. "There's something else," he said quietly. "I know you've been through all the details of the case, but this was found just the other day. I believe it was hidden in a place no one thought to look before now." Miss Marple unwrapped the paper slowly. Inside, nestled among folds of tissue, was a single small box. It was old, perhaps from the late 1800s, carved with intricate designs on the lid. She opened it carefully, revealing a tarnished silver key. Pike shifted uneasily. "I don't know who it belonged to," he said. "But when I found it, I had the strangest feeling. It was tucked behind the wall in the library, in one of the Colonel's old bookshelves." Miss Marple studied the key in silence for a moment, then smiled gently. "I believe I know exactly who it belonged to." Later that evening, as the village quieted, Miss Marple made her way to the Blackthorn estate. The house stood solemnly against the fading light, its once vibrant garden now muted in the cold autumn air. She had not visited since Cecily's departure, but there was one last thing to be done. The estate was still locked up, awaiting final distribution, but Miss Marple had a key, one she had borrowed from the solicitor earlier that day. She walked through the corridors with ease, as though the house had always been a part of her. She made her way to the library, where she had first sat with Colonel Erskine months before. The room was dark now, but Miss Marple knew the layout by heart. The tall bookshelves lined the walls, filled with the Colonel's collection of military history and legal texts. She moved toward the back corner, where a large, ornate cabinet stood. The key fit perfectly in the lock. Inside, behind layers of dust and forgotten papers, was another compartment, a small hidden drawer. Miss Marple opened it gently, revealing a bundle of old letters and a worn ledger. She took a deep breath, knowing that this was the last piece of the puzzle. She unfolded the first letter and read the date. Nearly 20 years ago. The writing was unmistakable. I did not ask for this life. I did not seek the past that has been forced upon me. But I will say this. I will not let him have the last word. There is too much at stake, too much at risk. I have kept silent for too long. I have kept my truth hidden for a reason. It's time to end it. Miss Marple paused, her fingers tracing the edges of the letter. She had suspected for some time that the Colonel's past had played a pivotal role in the events that had unfolded, but now she could see it clearly. The letter was from Pratap Mehra, the man who had once been Cecily's lover, who had died in the fire, and whose identity had been so carefully erased. The truth was clear now. The Colonel had been blackmailing Mehra. He had kept the man's past and the woman's guilt hidden to control them both. But in doing so, he had buried a larger truth, that Cecily had never truly been the one in control. Miss Marple carefully placed the letters back into the drawer, along with the ledger. The final secret of the Colonel's life had been revealed, the weight of his manipulation, his power over those who had once trusted him. The fear he had instilled had been as much a part of his legacy as his military career. But now that weight had been lifted. She stood for a long moment, listening to the silence of the room. The estate would go to Ned, as it should. Cecily would never return, but perhaps it was better that way. The past could not be changed, but it could be left behind. The following day, Miss Marple stood in the churchyard once more, her thoughts quiet as she watched the village go about its daily life. The funeral for Colonel Erskine had been attended only by a few, and the memorial plaque had already been placed in the church. It was all over now. The villagers would forget. The shadows would return to the corners. Life would go on. But Miss Marple knew that some things would never fade. The guilt, the lies, the years of secrets buried deep, those would remain, tucked away in the corners of Chipping Dean, just as they always had been. And as she turned to leave, her footsteps soft. On the stone path, Miss Marple smiled to herself. The dead may have their secrets, but she would always be there to unravel them.